The stench of burnt ozone doesn't belong in a penthouse. Vivian knew this, yet there she sat, watching a grease-stained mechanic drop 80 pounds of unpolished iron directly onto her million-dollar glass table. The impact sounded like a car crash. She called his machine a toxic paperweight. She was entirely wrong. Those scarred hands hadn't just built an engine. They had dismantled the world's energy grid. Forget everything you know about venture capital. This is how empires actually fall. Stick around. Fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that vibrated directly behind Vivian Mercer's left eye. It was a subtle grating sound, the kind that burrowed into the skull after 14 hours of pitch meetings. Her tailored silk blazer, sharp enough to cut glass, felt like a straitjacket. She pressed the pad of her thumb into her temple, trying to massage away the impending migraine, while her other hand traced the condensation sliding down her iced espresso. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. They were heavy, uneven, lacking the brisk, arrogant clip-clop of the Stanford graduates she had been eviscerating all morning. Instead, it was a dull thud, followed by the squeak of hard rubber wheels complaining against polished concrete. Vivian dropped her hand. She sat up, adjusting her posture until her spine was a rigid line of authority. Beside her, her assistant tapped nervously on an iPad. Through the frosted glass doors pushed Allergan Ford. He didn't walk in. He invaded the sterile, climate-controlled sanctuary of Mercer Capital. He dragged a reinforced steel cart behind him, and the smell hit the room before he even spoke. It was a dense, suffocating cloud of burnt lithium, stale sweat, and oxidized iron. It smelled like labor. It smelled like the industrial districts Vivian had spent her entire adult life clawing her way out of. Allergan didn't wear a blazer. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the elbows worn thin, and denim trousers stained with dark, irregular patches of grease. His hands were large knuckles, calloused and scarred, dirt permanently tattooed into the microscopic ridges of his fingerprints. "Mr. Ford," Vivian said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You are 34 minutes late." "Elevator wouldn't take the freight cart," Allergan muttered, not looking at her. His voice was gravelly scraped raw, lacking the polished cadence of a salesman. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he gripped the handles of his cart muscles in his forearms, bunching into thick cords, and heaved the object on top of it directly onto Vivian's custom million-dollar frosted glass conference table. The impact sounded like a car crash. The glass shuddered, groaning under the sudden immense weight. Vivian flinched, an involuntary spasm of her eyelid, before locking her features down into a mask of pure, unadulterated disdain. Sitting on her table was a monstrosity. It was a jagged amalgamation of copper coils, raw steel housing, and thick rubber tubing secured by industrial clamps. There was no sleek titanium casing. There were no glowing blue LEDs to signify smart technology. It was ugly. It was brutal. A single drop of viscous black fluid gathered at the tip of a brass nozzle and dropped onto the frosted glass with a sickening plop. "What?" Vivian asked, leaning forward so the scent of her expensive, unscented dry shampoo clashed with his oil fumes. "Is this scrap metal doing on my table?" That Allergan said, swiping a forearm across his brow, leaving a faint, dark smudge above his eyebrow, "is a closed-loop electromagnetic thruster. It operates at 96% efficiency." Vivian stared at him. She looked at the machine, then back at his exhausted, sunken eyes. She let out a short, hollow laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of a predator playing with its food. 96%. She repeated the sarcasm, dripping off her tongue like battery acid. "Mr. Ford, did you build this in a cave? Or did you just strip it out of a Cold War submarine?" Allergan's jaw tightened. "The aesthetics are secondary. The housing is just to keep the coil stabilized. The math, The math doesn't matter if it looks like a pipe bomb, Vivian snapped, dropping her pen onto the table. It clattered sharply. Do you know what my firm funds? We fund the future. The future is clean. It's seamless. It fits in the palm of a consumer's hand. This is a liability lawsuit waiting to happen. It's bleeding on my table. Allagan looked down at the puddle of oil. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked annoyed by her lack of vision. It's a prototype. The fluid is a cooling agent. It needs refinement, yes, but the core conversion rate defies current thermodynamic limits. If you look at the schematics— I don't need to look at the schematics, Vivian interrupted, standing up. The silk of her trousers whispered loudly in the silent room. I need you to look at reality. You walk in here smelling like a landfill, dumping hazardous waste on my furniture. And you expect me to write you a check. I wouldn't use this thing to power my lawn mower, let alone a commercial grid. Silence stretched between them. Allagan didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just stared at her with a quiet, unsettling pity that made Vivian's stomach twist defensively. You're looking at the paint, Allagan said quietly, his gravelly voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm offering you the engine. Take your engine! Vivian pointed toward the door, her perfectly manicured nail shaking almost imperceptibly. And get out of my building before I bill you for the glass. Allagan nodded, once a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't argue. He grabbed the heavy metal chassis, his knuckles turning white as he hoisted the 80-pound dead weight back onto his cart. The wheels squeaked agonizingly as he turned around and pushed it out the door. Vivian sat back down, staring at the small pool of dark oil left behind on the glass. Her assistant rushed forward with a microfiber cloth, but Vivian held up a hand, stopping him. She stared at the thick, iridescent liquid, feeling an uncomfortable heavy knot forming in her chest. She had won the exchange. She had crushed him. So why did she feel like she was the one who had just missed the train? Midnight rain slicked the streets of the industrial district, turning the cracked asphalt into a dark mirror, reflecting the sickly orange glow of sodium streetlights. Vivian sat in the back of her chauffeured town car, the leather seats plush and silent, shielding her from the decay outside. She held a crumpled oil-stained napkin in her hand. Allagan's assistant had slipped it into the firm's reception drop box 3 weeks ago, long before the pitch. It contained a single equation. Vivian had ignored it then. Tonight, sitting in the quiet luxury of her penthouse, she had finally looked at it. She wasn't an engineer, but she possessed a ruthless, predatory instinct for numbers. The variables on the napkin, scrawled in cheap blue ballpoint pen, balanced perfectly. If the math was real, Allagan Ford hadn't just built an engine. He had dismantled the laws of physics and reassembled them to his liking. Stop here, she told her driver, her voice tight. The car glided to a halt in front of a rusted, corrugated metal door. The neighborhood smelled of wet decay, exhaust fumes, and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching thunderstorm. Vivian stepped out into the drizzle. She wore a heavy cashmere trench coat, her heels clicking aggressively against the broken pavement. She hated this. She hated the vulnerability of second-guessing herself, but the contradiction gnawed at her. How could a man so entirely out of his depth build something so profound? She pushed open the heavy side door of the warehouse. It wasn't locked. The inside of the garage assaulted her senses. The air was thick and heavy, tasting of copper and ozone. A massive overhead fan chopped lazily at the smoke, billowing from a welding torch in the center of the room. Sparks cascaded like vicious tiny stars, illuminating the cavernous, chaotic space. Tools were scattered everywhere. Wrenches, micrometers, half-empty mugs of coffee, with mold blooming on the rims. Allagan sat on a metal stool bent over the same ugly engine from her boardroom. He wore a heavy leather apron over a thermal shirt. He wasn't using the torch. He was hand-filing a piece of tungsten, the metal screaming a high-pitched, toothacheing protest with every drag of the file. Vivian stepped forward, the crunch of a stray bolt under her shoe announcing her presence. Allagan stopped. He didn't jump. He slowly turned his head, his face illuminated by a solitary, swinging work light. His eyes were red-rimmed, sunken deep into bruised-looking sockets. When he recognized her, his expression didn't change. He just turned back to the tungsten. "I didn't invite you," he said, his voice competing with the hum of a massive generator in the corner. "I don't need invitations," Vivian replied, walking closer, trying to avoid brushing her cashmere coat against grease-stained workbenches. I read the napkin. Allagan paused his filing. He blew metallic dust off the joint. And it's theoretical?" she said, crossing her arms, creating a physical barrier between herself and the grime of his world. "You can make numbers do whatever you want on paper. Getting them to work in a physical space, balancing heat displacement with magnetic drag. It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Allagan said, not looking up. "Just expensive and difficult. You don't like difficult things, Ms. Mercer. You like things that come in pretty boxes." Vivian's jaw clenched. "Don't psychoanalyze me, mechanic. I came here because I want to know if you faked the data." Allagan finally dropped the file. It clanged loudly against the metal table. He stood up, turning to face her. In the dim light, she noticed a fresh, raw scrape across his knuckles, a bright crimson bead swelling against the dirty skin. He ignored it. "I spent 6 years in this garage," Allagan said, stepping toward her. He didn't smell like a landfill anymore. Up close, he smelled of raw determination, sweat heat, and burnt coffee. "I missed my brother's funeral because I was recalibrating the cooling loop. I sold my house to buy the neodymium magnets sitting inside that ugly casing. Do not stand in my shop wearing a coat that costs more than my entire fabrication budget and accuse me of faking my life's work." Vivian held her ground, refusing to shrink back, though her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't fear. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that he was entirely sincere. In her world of vaporware and silver-tongued charlatans, absolute sincerity was the rarest, most dangerous commodity. "Then why didn't you explain it?" She fired back, her voice rising, cracking the cynical veneer she usually wore so perfectly. "Why did you come into my office and act like a mute? If this is the holy grail of thermodynamics, why couldn't you sell it?" "Because it shouldn't need a salesman," Allagan yelled, slamming his good hand onto the table. The sudden noise made Vivian flinch. "It speaks for itself. The math speaks for itself. I am an engineer, not a carnival barker. If you people were half as smart as you pretend to be, you wouldn't need me to dance for you to see what's right in front of your eyes." He breathed heavily, his chest heaving, the anger draining out of him as quickly as it had flared, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. He reached for a rag and pressed it against his scraped knuckle, grimacing. Vivian stared at him. Her entire career was built on packaging. She bought pretty things, funded smooth talkers, and sold them to the public at a premium. She was the problem he was screaming about. She looked past him at the engine. In the dim garage light, devoid of the sterile boardroom context, it didn't look ugly anymore. It looked functional. It looked like survival. "There's an open pitch summit on Thursday," Vivian said, her voice dropping, retreating behind a wall of cold professionalism. "Silicon Valley's worst vultures will be there. Bring it. Don't clean it. Just bring the math." "Are you backing me?" Allagan asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "No." Vivian lied, her stomach churning. "But I want to watch you try to sell it to someone else." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the smell of ozone behind. stepping back into the cold, familiar rain. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel smelled overwhelmingly of catered salmon expensive gin and the cloying synthetic sweetness of men's cologne. The air was thick with the suffocating hum of forced networking. Hundreds of venture capitalists in identical fleece vests and custom Italian loafers milled about, sipping drinks while waiting for the next slaughter on the main stage. Vivian sat in the back row, shrouded in the shadows of the mezzanine. She wore a stark black turtleneck and severe trousers, a deliberate contrast to the peacocking crowd below. She held a glass of sparkling water. The ice long melted her fingers, tapping a restless, erratic rhythm against the crystal. On stage, Allegan Ford was dying. He stood behind a podium bathed in a harsh white spotlight that made him look pale and ill. The massive, ugly engine sat on a reinforced table next to him. He was wearing a suit clearly rented, poorly fitted the collar choking his thick neck. He looked miserable. So, Allegan mumbled into the microphone, causing a sharp squeal of feedback that made half the room wince. The thermal load is distributed through the copper coils, which negates the need for external exhaust. He was stumbling. He kept looking at his index cards, his large hands fumbling with the thin paper. The audience was already lost. Phones were out. Quiet chatter swelled, drowning out his gravelly, hesitant voice. In the front row sat Gregory Hayes. Gregory was a shark, dressed in a tailored grey suit, smelling of peppermint and old money. He leaned back in his chair, a cruel, lazy smile playing on his lips. Gregory didn't build things. He tore them down for sport, buying the scrap at a discount. "Mr. Ford," Gregory interrupted loudly, not bothering to use a microphone. His voice cut through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "I'm looking at your schematics on my tablet. I have to say it looks like a middle school science fair project gone rogue." A ripple of laughter echoed through the ballroom. Allegan froze. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. The aesthetics aren't the point. If you look at the energy output, I am looking at the output, Gregory sneered, twirling a gold pen. And I'm looking at a machine that weighs 80 pounds and leaks cooling fluid on stage. We fund scalable microtech. We don't fund steampunk paperweights. Who on earth told you to drag this scrap metal in here? Vivian watched from the dark. Her stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. It was the same insult she had used. Hearing it from Gregory's mouth, watching Allegan shrink under the spotlight, didn't make her feel vindicated. It made her feel a sudden, violent surge of territorial rage. "That's my scrap metal," a dark, cynical voice whispered in her head. "And you're too stupid to read the math, Gregory." She didn't plan it. She didn't think about the market optics or her firm's quarterly risk assessment. Vivian Mercer, the ice queen of venture capital, operated on instinct, and right now her instinct was to draw blood. She stood up. The sudden movement caught the attention of the ushers in the back. She walked down the center aisle, her heels striking the carpet with dull, measured thuds. "He dragged it in here because I told him to, Gregory." Vivian's voice rang out cold and amplified as she snatched a wireless microphone from an usher's hand. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Heads snapped toward her. Gregory's lazy smile faltered, replaced by a look of cautious confusion. Allegan looked up, his eyes widening. Vivian walked until she was standing just a few feet behind Gregory's chair, staring up at Allegan on the stage. "You're looking at the paint, Greg," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venom echoing through the massive speakers. "You always were a superficial reader. Try looking at the engine." Gregory bristled, standing up to face her. "Vivian, didn't know you were slumming it today. If you've read the schematics, you'd know this thing is unscalable. It's an unscalable prototype of a closed-loop electromagnetic thruster operating at 96% efficiency." Vivian recited, staring unblinkingly at Gregory. It breaks the second law of thermodynamics over its knee. If you weren't so busy trying to formulate a clever tweet, you'd realize he just handed you the key to off-grid municipal power. She turned her gaze up to Allagan, who was staring at her with raw shock. 10 million, Vivian said smoothly into the mic. The room gasped. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen from the ballroom. Venture capitalists sat up straight, shoving their phones into their pockets. Gregory's face flushed. His ego was directly tied to his wallet, and Vivian had just humiliated him in front of his peers. He looked at the ugly engine, then back at Vivian. He didn't understand the tech, but he understood blood in the water. If Vivian wanted it, it was valuable. 15 million, Gregory barked. Vivian smiled. It was a terrifying, humorless expression. She took a step closer to the stage, the adrenaline burning away her headache, replacing it with the sharp, metallic taste of warfare. 20, she shot back instantly. 25, yelled a voice from the left side of the room. A rival firm had just jumped in. The scent of a feeding frenzy was irresistible. 30. Gregory counted sweat beading on his forehead. Vivian looked at Allagan. He was gripping the podium, watching the chaotic eruption of greed and panic unfold in front of him. He wasn't smiling. He looked horrified, realizing that his life's work, his sleepless nights, his bleeding hands were just poker chips to these people. But as his eyes locked with Vivian's, she gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. A silent acknowledgement. Let them bleed. $50 million, Vivian said, quietly into the microphone. The sound system picked up the lethal calm in her voice, projecting it over the rising clamor. For exclusive licensing rights, and we keep the prototype exactly as it is. Silence slammed back down on the room. Gregory opened his mouth, then closed it slowly, sitting back down, defeated. The other firms muttered amongst themselves, but nobody dared challenge the bid. Vivian didn't look back at them. She kept her eyes on the grease-stained mechanic on the stage, the only real thing in a room full of fakes. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Mercer Capital smelled of lemon polish and wealth. It was a sterile, unforgiving scent that left a dry coating on the back of the throat. The soundproofing in the walls was so aggressive that the silence felt heavy, pressing against the eardrums like a physical weight. Allagan Ford sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, staring at a stack of paper, 120 pages thick. The document was still warm from the high-capacity laser printer. It smelled sharply of bleach and melted toner. Next to the paper lay a Mont Blanc fountain pen. Black resin platinum trim, perfectly balanced. Allagan hadn't touched it. His hands rested on his thighs, his heavy work boots sinking awkwardly into the hand-woven Persian rug. He looked entirely out of place, a rough-hewn stone dropped onto a silk pillow. The bruised skin across his knuckles stood out violently against the pristine white of the contract pages. Vivian sat opposite him, watching. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white blouse, her posture immaculate. 3 corporate attorneys flanked her, silent and motionless as gargoyles in custom Armani. They were waiting. The $50 million bid had ended the spectacle in the ballroom, but this room was where the actual trap was set. The terms are exactly as we discussed in the car, Vivian said, her voice smooth, cutting through the oppressive silence. 10 million upfront for operational transition and personal debt clearance. 40 million locked in a trust dispersed upon the delivery of a viable commercial-ready prototype. We hold exclusive licensing. You retain patent authorship. Allagan finally reached out and picked up the pen. His thick, calloused fingers dwarfed the elegant instrument. He turned it over, feeling the slick resin. He hated how it felt. It lacked friction. It offered no resistance. A commercial-ready prototype. Allagan repeated his gravelly voice, sounding loud and unpolished in the quiet room. Your lawyers defined that on page 47 as a unit that meets industrial aesthetic standards and passes standard consumer safety audits. That is correct. One of the attorneys, a man with razor-sharp cheekbones and a silk tie, chimed in. The engine cannot be housed in exposed raw steel. It needs to be market viable. You mean it needs to look pretty? Allagan said, tossing the pen onto the contract. It landed with a dull thwack. I told you yesterday, Ms. Mercer, the electromagnetic displacement field interacts with standard commercial alloys. If you box this thing up in a shiny titanium shell so your investors can feel safe, you'll disrupt the cooling loop. It will overheat. Vivian leaned forward, folding her hands on the polished wood. She felt the familiar cold prickle of irritation. She had just handed this mechanic the lottery, and he was arguing about the color of the ticket. Allagan, she said, using his first name to force a false sense of intimacy. We just secured $50 million. I embarrassed my biggest rival, and I staked the reputation of my firm on a machine that leaked oil onto a stage. Do not tell me what we cannot do. We will hire materials engineers. We will source non-ferrous thermal-resistant composites. But I cannot sell an exposed 80-pound hazard to the Department of Energy. Allagan stared at her. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the past 48 hours draining away to leave deep, bruised shadows under his eyes. He didn't see a savior sitting across from him. He saw a warden who had just bought the keys to his life. I don't work with other engineers, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. They overthink the math. They rely on simulation software instead of actually feeling the metal bend. I work alone. You used to work alone. Vivian corrected her tone, hardening. She tapped a single manicured fingernail against the mahogany. You worked alone in a damp garage, nearly went bankrupt, and couldn't string 2 sentences together to save your life on a stage. That era is over. You belong to Mercer Capital now. We are moving your equipment to a state-of-the-art facility in San Jose by Friday. Allagan's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck strained against the collar of his faded flannel shirt. He looked at the contract. It was a lifeline. It meant keeping his house. It meant paying off the crippling debts he had accumulated, buying neodymium magnets and liquid cooling agents. But as he looked at the crisp white pages, he felt an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. He picked up the Mont Blanc again. He didn't read the rest of the clauses. He simply turned to the final page, pressed the platinum nib against the paper, and signed his name in a jagged, uneven scrawl. The ink bled slightly into the thick paper. He pushed the stack across the table. San Jose. Allagan said, his voice flat, devoid of any celebration. He stood up the leather chair, squeaking in protest. Send me the address. I need to pack up my tools. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, his heavy boots thudding against the carpet, leaving the door open behind him. Vivian didn't smile. She pulled the contract toward her, looking at his messy signature. The attorneys immediately began shuffling papers, organizing copies, murmuring about filing dates and escrow accounts. She ignored them. She stared at the blue ink on the page. She had won. She possessed the most revolutionary piece of technology of the decade. Yet, as the faint smell of burnt ozone and engine grease lingered in the air, slowly fading beneath the overwhelming scent of lemon polish, Vivian felt a sharp, entirely unwelcome pang of guilt. 60 days later, the San Jose Research and Development Facility smelled like rubbing alcohol and failure. Vivian stood behind a thick wall of reinforced blast-proof glass, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The observation deck was freezing, the air conditioning blasting at a constant 68 degrees to keep the server racks humming happily. Below her, The testing floor was a sprawling expanse of pristine white epoxy, bathed in the harsh, shadowless glare of overhead LED panels. It looked like a hospital operating room. And right now the patient was dying. In the center of the room sat the Mark II prototype. Vivian's newly hired team of aerospace designers had spent 4 weeks and $2 million housing Allergan's ugly engine in a sleek aerodynamic casing made of brushed carbon titanium composite. It looked gorgeous. It looked like a piece of alien technology, smooth and seamless, with subtle blue indicator lights pulsing along its chassis. It was exactly what Vivian wanted to show the board of directors next Tuesday. There was just one problem. It didn't work. Through the glass, Vivian watched Allergan pacing like a caged animal. He was wearing a stark white lab coat that he clearly despised, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal his scarred forearms. He held a thermal scanner in his left hand, aiming it at the gleaming Mark II. Next to him stood Dr. Eris Thorne Mercer Capital's lead materials engineer, holding a tablet and pointing nervously at a fluctuating graph. The internal temperature is exceeding 400 Celsius. Aris's voice crackled through the intercom speaker on the observation deck. He sounded panicked. The composite shell is trapping the thermal runoff. The cooling loop is boiling. "I told you the shell was too tight," Allergan roared, dropping the scanner onto a stainless steel workbench with a loud clatter. He didn't care about the $2 million casing. He grabbed a heavy pneumatic wrench from a tool rack. "Shut down the primary intake. We have to crack the housing before the coils fuse. We can't just crack it," Aris yelled back, holding up his hands. "The composite is sealed under a vacuum to prevent atmospheric interference. If you break the seal while it's at this temperature, the sudden oxygen influx could—" A high-pitched, tooth-aching whine pierced the air, vibrating through the reinforced glass of the observation deck. It sounded like metal screaming. Vivian flinched, stepping closer to the glass. Suddenly, a thick plume of acrid black smoke violently vented from the seam of the beautiful titanium casing. The blue indicator lights flickered, turned a sickly yellow, and died. A loud pop echoed through the chamber, followed by the sickening hiss of boiling liquid hitting a hot surface. The Mark II shuddered once, violently, and went entirely still. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Allergan stood frozen, his chest heaving, the heavy wrench hanging limply in his hand. He stared at the smoking ruin of the engine. The beautiful casing had blistered the composite, melting into ugly, jagged black bubbles. Vivian closed her eyes, pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. A migraine, sharp and unforgiving, bloomed behind her left eye. $2 million in fabrication, 60 days of labor, and a looming board meeting, all reduced to a pile of expensive smoking trash. She turned on her heel, pushed open the heavy door of the observation deck, and walked down the steel staircase to the testing floor. The smell hit her immediately. It wasn't the honest, gritty smell of Allergan's garage. This was the toxic, synthetic stench of burning polymers and melted wiring. It smelled expensive and wrong. Her heels clicked sharply against the white epoxy floor. Allergan didn't turn around. He just kept staring at the blistered casing. Oris took one look at Vivian's face, clutched his tablet to his chest, and quickly scurried toward the far end of the lab. "I want a full damage report by tonight," Vivian said, stopping a few feet behind Allergan. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the screaming anger most CEOs would have unleashed. "Can the core coils be salvaged?" Allergan slowly turned around. His face was smeared with a streak of black soot, his eyes burning with a furious, exhausted intensity. He didn't look intimidated by her calm demeanor. He looked ready to break something. "Salvaged." Allergan laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. "The coils are slag. The magnetic alignment is entirely warped. The core is dead. You just cooked a $50 million piece of physics inside a fancy Tupperware container. Do not use that tone with me." Vivian snapped the ice in her voice, cracking just a fraction. "We hired the best materials team on the West Coast to design that housing. They ran 80 separate computer simulations. The thermal displacement was supposed to vent through the micropores in the composite. Computer simulations don't account for reality," Allagan yelled, throwing the pneumatic wrench onto the floor. It bounced against the pristine white epoxy, leaving a nasty black scuff mark. "In reality, metal expands. In reality, a closed-loop electromagnetic field creates a localized friction vacuum. I told your engineers that the housing needed to breathe. I told them the ugly, jagged steel I used in my garage wasn't just for show. The uneven surface area acted as a passive heat sink." Vivian stared at the scuff mark on her floor, then looked back at Allagan. "You didn't explain the thermodynamic properties of the surface area. You just told them it was wrong and refused to attend the integration meetings, because I am not a corporate babysitter." Allagan took a step toward her, the smell of burnt synthetic plastic clinging to his clothes. "You took me out of my shop. You put me in this sterile, fluorescent cage. You forced me to wear this stupid coat, surrounded me with kids who think a tablet is a substitute for feeling a motor vibrate in your hands, and you expected me to just pump out miracles on a spreadsheet schedule." He stopped breathing heavily, rubbing a hand furiously over his face, smearing the soot further into his skin. "You didn't buy my engine, Vivian," he said quietly, the anger turning into a profound, heavy sadness. "You bought my patent. And then you tried to build a completely different machine, one that looks good on a PowerPoint. This failure isn't on my math. It's on your packaging." Vivian looked past him at the ruined Mark II. The smoke was still curling lazily toward the massive industrial ceiling vents. She hated being wrong. She hated the messy, unpredictable nature of physical engineering. But as she stood in the sterile lab, looking at the man whose genius she was actively suffocating, a deeply buried pragmatic instinct began to override her corporate ego. She looked down at her immaculate tailored trousers, then at the puddle of cooling fluid seeping from the bottom of the machine. "Aris!" Vivian barked, her voice echoing off the white walls. The engineer practically jumped from the shadows. "Yes, Ms. Mercer. Fire the external design firm," she ordered, not looking away from Allagan. "Cancel the order for the replacement composite, and go to a hardware store, a real one, not a supplier. Buy 50 pounds of raw, unpolished industrial steel." Aris blinked, confused. "But the aesthetic presentation for the board?" "Tell the board they can look at a spreadsheet if they want something pretty," Vivian said coldly. She finally locked eyes with Allagan. "We're going to build it your way. Ugly, no micropores, no vacuum seals, just raw surface area and math." Allagan stared at her, the hostility slowly draining from his posture, replaced by a cautious, guarded disbelief. He wiped his greasy hands on his pristine white lab coat, utterly ruining it. "It's going to look like a pipe bomb," he warned her, his voice low. "I don't care," Vivian said, turning away the faint metallic taste of a massive gamble bitter on her tongue. "Just make sure this one doesn't blow up my building." Sparks chewed through the sterile atmosphere of the San Jose lab, spitting violently against the white epoxy floor. The high-pitched scream of an angle grinder gnawing into raw, unpolished steel echoed off the reinforced glass. Allagan Ford had transformed the billion-dollar research facility into a subterranean chop shop. Piles of heavy pitted metal lay scattered around the workstation. The sleek titanium fragments of the failed Mark II had been swept unceremoniously into a corner, replaced by thick sheets of industrial iron copper, tubing thick as a man's wrist, and industrial-grade thermal paste that smelled strongly of ammonia and dead fish. Vivienne stood a few feet away holding a styrofoam cup of black coffee. She hadn't left the lab in 2 days. Her charcoal blazer was draped over a chair, her silk blouse wrinkled, the sleeves pushed up. The deep, throbbing headache had become a permanent fixture behind her eyes, kept at bay only by caffeine and sheer, stubborn spite. "Hold this," Allagan commanded, his voice raspy and exhausted. He didn't look up. He was wearing a heavy welding mask, kneeling beside the exposed core of the new engine. Aris, the materials engineer, took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling slightly in his pristine lab coat. I really shouldn't get near the magnetic field while the casing is ungrounded. The safety protocols—" "I don't care about the protocols," Allagan barked, flipping the mask up. Sweat dripped from his nose, tracking through a thick layer of grime on his cheeks. "I need 150 pounds of pressure on this clamp. While I fuse the joint or the thermal plate will warp. If it warps, the whole thing cooks again." Oris swallowed hard, stepping back. Vivienne set her coffee down on a steel cart. She walked over the sharp click of her heels, replaced by the soft scuff of leather on debris. She knelt beside Allagan on the hard floor, the abrasive surface biting immediately into the knees of her tailored trousers. "Show me," she said flatly. Allagan blinked, surprised for a fraction of a second before his exhausted pragmatism took over. He pointed a thick, heavily scarred finger at a pair of iron grips clamped onto a thick copper pipe. "Grab the handles. Squeeze them together. Do not let go until I kill the torch. It's going to get hot." Vivienne grabbed the grips. The metal was already warm, coated in a fine layer of greasy dust that immediately embedded itself into her skin. She squeezed. The resistance was immense, requiring her to lock her elbows and lean her entire upper body weight into her arms. "Hold it steady," Allagan muttered, flipping his mask back down. The welding torch ignited with a sharp hiss. A blinding blue-white light flooded the space, casting long, monstrous shadows against the white walls. Heat blasted Vivienne's face, dry and suffocating. The smell of burning flux and melting metal filled her lungs, heavy and metallic. Through the thick leather of the gloves Allagan had tossed her, she felt the temperature of the clamp rising. It went from warm to uncomfortably hot, to a searing, burning ache that radiated up her forearms. Her muscles trembled violently under the strain. Her perfectly manicured nails dug painfully into her palms through the gloves. "Let go," her brain screamed. "This is not your job. You write checks. You do not bleed." She gritted her teeth, locking her jaw until it ached. She watched the bright blue arc of the torch biting into the metal, fusing the ugly, heavy iron together. It was a brutal, violent process. There was no elegance here, no sleek corporate synergy. It was just heat pressure and the sheer will to force the physical world to obey a mathematical absolute. "Done!" Allagan grunted, killing the flame. Vivienne released the clamp, falling back on her heels, gasping for air she hadn't realized she was holding. She stripped the heavy leather gloves off. The skin on her palms was bright red, stinging furiously. A black smudge of grease streaked across the cuff of her expensive white blouse. Allagan pushed his mask up, wiping his forehead with a filthy rag. He looked at the joint, tracing a bare finger over the cooling weld. It was thick, jagged, and perfectly sealed. He looked over at Vivienne, taking in her ruined clothes and the fierce, defiant glare she was giving him, while cradling her burning hands. "You ruined your shirt." He noted his voice, quiet, lacking its usual defensive edge. "I can buy 1,000 shirts," Vivienne rasped, pushing herself up from the floor, her knees aching. "Does the heat sink work now?" "The surface area is completely uneven," Allagan said, tapping the ugly, bulbous casing they had just attached. "It looks like a tumor. but the thermal displacement will radiate perfectly into the ambient air. It won't suffocate. Vivian stared at the machine. It was horrifying to look at. A hulking 80-pound monstrosity of exposed copper coils, raw iron plates, and thick rubber hosing secured by industrial zip ties. It looked exactly like the scrap metal she had mocked in her boardroom months ago. Only now she knew the blood and heat required to build it. "Good," Vivian said, her voice dropping back into its cold, authoritative register, though her hands still shook slightly. "Bolt it to a cart. The board meets in 10 hours. Allergan looked at the engine, then at her. "They're going to hate it. It's everything they told you not to fund." "Let them hate it," Vivian replied, turning to grab her cold coffee, ignoring the sting in her palms. "I didn't bring them here to like it. I brought them here to pay for it." Tuesday morning arrived with the suffocating pressure of a coming storm. The executive boardroom on the top floor of Mercer Capital smelled of cedarwood expensive pastries and the sharp, anxious sweat of billionaires who hated being kept waiting. Richard, the chairman of the board, sat at the head of the table. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and old money. His silver hair perfectly coiffed his bespoke suit, immaculate. He drummed his fingers against the mahogany, his pale blue eyes fixed on the heavy double oak doors. "Vivian is exactly 14 minutes late." Richard noted his voice, a dry, papery rasp. "At $50 million of corporate liability, I expect punctuality if nothing else." Gregory Hayes, sitting halfway down the table, smirked behind his coffee cup. He had bought a seat on the board 3 years ago, just to have a front-row view of Vivian's eventual failure. "Perhaps the mechanic built her a time machine, Richard. Let's give her a moment." A low ripple of amused, cynical laughter circled the table. The heavy oak doors suddenly groaned open. Vivian walked in. She was wearing a stark black suit, sharp and unyielding, completely devoid of the soot and grease from the night before. However, she wasn't walking with her usual swift, arrogant glide. She was walking slowly, deliberately. Behind her, flanked by 2 security guards, Allergan Ford pushed a heavy steel utility cart. The cart squealed in protest, the wheels biting deep into the plush hand-woven Persian rug, leaving permanent tracks. The laughter died instantly. The smell hit the room like a physical blow. The raw, acrid scent of ozone, burnt flux, and industrial oil violently overpowered the cedarwood and coffee. Several board members physically recoiled in their expensive leather chairs. Allergan shoved the cart to the center of the room, parallel to the mahogany table. He looked worse than the machine. His eyes were hollow, bruised, purple with exhaustion. His hands were wrapped in white medical tape, stained brown with dried blood and grease. He locked the wheels of the cart and stepped back, crossing his arms over his faded flannel shirt. Sitting on the cart was the Mark III. It was a jagged, scarred lump of heavy iron and copper. The welding joints were thick and ugly. There were no lights, no polished casing. It looked like a salvaged piece of artillery. Richard stared at the machine, his upper lip curling in profound disgust. "Vivian, what is this?" "Refuse doing in my boardroom," this Vivian said, stepping up to the cart and resting a perfectly manicured hand flat against the cold pitted iron, "is what you paid $50 million for, Richard." "I paid for a scalable, market-ready prototype." Richard fired back his voice, rising, slapping his palm flat on the table. "I have read the R&D reports. You spent $2 million on a carbon titanium casing that melted, and now you drag this hazard into my building. It looks like a pipe bomb." "It looked like a pipe bomb to me too," Vivian said smoothly, her voice a lethal calm hum that forced the room to lean in, until I realized we were trying to put a tuxedo on a hurricane. She turned away from the board and looked at Allergan. She gave him a single, sharp nod. Allagan stepped forward. He didn't look at the billionaires. He picked up a thick, heavy-duty power cable connected to the back of the engine and plugged it into a massive portable battery block on the bottom shelf of the cart. He flipped a series of crude metal toggle switches. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure change. The hairs on Vivian's arms stood straight up. A deep, bone-rattling vibration started in the floorboards, traveling up the mahogany legs of the table, rattling the fine china saucers under the coffee cups. The surface of the water in Gregory Hayes's glass began to ripple furiously in microscopic, concentric circles. The hum became audible, a low, throbbing, rhythmic pulse that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat. The exposed copper coils began to glow with a faint, terrifyingly beautiful blue luminescence, entirely a byproduct of the magnetic friction, not decorative LEDs. The internal temperature is stabilizing at 40 degrees Celsius. Allagan rasped, staring at a digital meter wired haphazardly to the side of the iron casing. The thermal displacement is radiating passively. The loop is closed. Vivian looked down the table. The boardroom was dead silent, save for the heavy, vibrating thrum of the engine. Richard's mouth was slightly open. Gregory was staring at his rippling water glass, his face pale, entirely devoid of his usual arrogance. They didn't understand the thermodynamics, but they understood power. They could feel it in their chests. This machine, Vivian said, her voice cutting through the hum, carrying the weight of absolute certainty, is currently generating enough stable, localized electromagnetic energy to power this entire city block. And it is doing it with zero external exhaust, zero carbon byproduct, and zero reliance on a grid. She walked slowly down the length of the table, her heels clicking in time with the machine's rhythmic pulse. "You wanted something pretty, Richard," she said, stopping right behind his chair. "Pretty is for consumer electronics. Pretty is for things that break in 3 years so you can sell them a replacement. This is not a consumer product. This is infrastructure. It is ugly because it has to survive the real world. We aren't selling them a sleek gadget." She leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper right next to the chairman's ear, though the entire room could hear the cold, predatory greed dripping from every word. "We are selling them the end of the fossil fuel era, and we hold the only patent on Earth." Richard swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the jagged, glowing mass of iron on the cart. The smell of ozone in the room was suffocating, tasting like lightning at the back of the throat. He looked at Vivian, recognizing the ruthless, undeniable truth in her eyes. "The patent is secure," Richard croaked, his voice lacking its usual thunder. "Ironclad." Vivian lied smoothly, ignoring the fact that Allagan Ford, the man who still owned the soul of the machine, was standing 10 feet away, watching them with quiet, exhausted disgust. She had won the boardroom. The 50 million was safe. But as Vivian looked over at the mechanic in the dirty flannel shirt, watching him gently adjust a valve on his ugly, perfect engine, she realized the war hadn't even started. The San Jose facility was terrifyingly quiet at 2 a.m. The daytime chaos of scrambling technicians and shouting executives had vanished, leaving only the low ambient hum of the server racks and the faint smell of cooling fluid. Allagan Ford sat on an overturned plastic crate in the center of the testing floor. He was drinking cheap, lukewarm beer from a crushed aluminum can. His knuckles were wrapped in fresh medical tape, the skin underneath throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. He stared at the Mark III. It sat in the shadows, a hulking, silent beast of raw iron. It was ugly. It was perfect. A sharp click echoed from the far end of the lab. The heavy security door swung open, the magnetic lock disengaging with a soft hiss. Allagan didn't move. He just took another sip of his warm beer. Footsteps approached. They weren't the heavy, purposeful thuds of a security guard. They were the slick, sliding sounds of leather-soled shoes on epoxy. A familiar scent rolled in ahead of the intruder peppermint, expensive dry cleaning, and the synthetic musk of high-end cologne. Gregory Hayes stepped into the dim light of the overhead emergency LEDs. He wore a cashmere overcoat, his hands shoved deeply into his pockets. He looked around the grease-stained chop shop Allergan had built in the middle of a billion-dollar facility, his nose wrinkling in involuntary disgust. "The security guard at the loading dock makes $40,000 a year," Gregory said smoothly, breaking the silence. "A $5,000 envelope goes a very long way, Mr. Ford." Allergan crushed the empty beer can in his massive hand. It made a loud, sharp crack. "You're trespassing, Hayes." "I prefer the term scouting," Gregory replied, taking a few steps closer, though he kept a safe distance from the oily workbench. He looked at the Mark III, his eyes narrowing with a predatory hunger. "I saw what happened in the boardroom today. Vivian played it perfectly. She terrifies them so they obey her. But I'm not Richard. I don't scare easily. And I know a hostage situation when I see one." Allergan shifted his weight on the crate. "I'm not a hostage. I signed a contract." "You signed a paper cage," Gregory corrected, pulling his hands out of his pockets. He held a thick, folded, cream-colored document. "Vivian Mercer doesn't build partnerships. She builds dependencies. She gave you $50 million, sure, but she locked 40 of it in a trust tied to commercial viability. And who defines viability? Her lawyers. She owns your patent Allergan. She owns your physics. When she gets tired of your insubordination, she will fire you keep the engine, and you will spend the next 20 years fighting her in court just to use your own math." Allergan stared at the floor. The heavy silence of the lab pressed against his eardrums. Gregory's words weren't a revelation. They were the exact paranoid thoughts that kept Allergan awake every night, gnawing at the back of his skull like rats in a wall. "And you have a better offer?" Allergan asked, his voice scraping the bottom of his throat. "I have a buyout clause," Gregory said, stepping forward and tossing the document onto the steel workbench. It landed next to a puddle of dirty motor oil. "My firm will cover the $10 million penalty to break Mercer's exclusivity. We give you full autonomy, your own lab, your own team, and you keep 70% of the patent rights. We don't want to cage you, Allergan. We want to unleash you." Allergan looked at the cream-colored paper. It was thick, textured, and smelled faintly of lavender. It was a lifeline. It was a way out of the suffocating corporate chokehold Vivian had placed on his throat. He reached out and picked it up. His greasy, bruised fingers left immediate, ugly, dark smudges on the pristine paper. Gregory smiled a lazy, victorious smirk. "Vivian looks at you and sees a mechanic she has to manage. I look at you and see the next Edison." Allergan stared at the smudges he had left on the contract. He traced the dark grease with his thumb. Then he looked up at Gregory. He looked at Gregory's hands. They were pale, soft, and perfectly manicured. Not a single callus. Not a single scar. A memory, sharp and violent, flashed in Allergan's mind. He saw Vivian Mercer, the ice queen of venture capital, kneeling on the hard epoxy floor. He saw her wearing an expensive silk blouse, ruined with soot. He remembered the smell of burning metal, the blinding blue light of the torch, and the sight of her hands trembling violently as she held a searing hot iron clamp, refusing to let go, refusing to break the seal, bleeding for the math. "You think Vivian looks at me like a mechanic?" Allergan said quietly. "She does," Gregory insisted. "Maybe." Allergan agreed, standing up. He towered over Gregory, the sheer physical mass of his shoulders blocking out the ambient light. But yesterday, when the thermal casing failed, she didn't hand me a spreadsheet. She got on her knees and held a red-hot iron pipe so I could fuse the core. Gregory's smirk faltered. What are you talking about? Allagan stepped closer. The smell of raw sweat and ozone rolling off him forced Gregory to take a physical step backward. Vivian is a ruthless, blood-sucking vulture. Allagan growled his voice, a low, terrifying rumble. She is greedy. She is arrogant. But when the metal cracked, she bled for it. Allagan grabbed the lapel of Gregory's cashmere coat. Gregory flinched, panic flashing in his eyes. You won't even stand too close to my workbench because you're afraid of getting your shoes dirty. Allagan shoved the cream-colored contract hard into Gregory's chest. You don't want to unleash me, Hayes, Allagan said, his eyes burning. You just want to steal the engine without getting grease on your hands. Get out of my lab. Gregory stumbled back, clutching the crumpled, dirty contract. His face flushed a dark, furious red. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten, but the sheer, violent exhaustion radiating from the mechanic silenced him. He turned on his heel and walked fast toward the exit, the magnetic door clicking shut behind him, leaving Allagan alone in the quiet hum of the machines. Dawn crept through the high-security skylights of the San Jose facility, painting the white epoxy floors in a cold, slate-gray light. Vivian sat at the steel workbench, shivering slightly. She wore the same black trousers from the board meeting, but she had swapped the blazer for a heavy, oversized fleece pullover she had found in a supply closet. She was drinking black coffee from a styrofoam cup, staring at the crumpled, grease-stained contract Allagan had casually tossed onto the desk 10 minutes ago. Allagan was under the Mark III, his back pressed against a creeper board, wrenching a heavy brass valve into place. The violent metallic clank of his tools echoed sharply in the empty lab. He offered you 70% of the patent, Vivian said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. She didn't sound angry. She sounded calculating. He did, Allagan grunted, tightening a bolt until his shoulder popped. And he offered to pay the $10 million breach penalty. Yep. Vivian took a sip of her coffee. It was bitter-burnt and tasted vaguely of aluminum. Why didn't you sign it? Allagan rolled out from under the machine. He sat up, wiping a streak of black grease off his forehead with the back of his wrist. He looked at her. He didn't look at the expensive clothes or the perfect posture. He looked at her hands. Across her palms, peeking out from the sleeves of the fleece, were 2 thick, ugly red burn marks, raw and blistering. Because Hayes is a parasite, Allagan said flatly. He buys things after they work. He doesn't know how to fix things when they break, and this machine is going to break a lot before we scale it to a municipal grid. Vivian set the coffee down. She looked at her burnt hands, flexing her fingers. The skin pulled tight, sending a sharp, stinging pain up her forearms. She didn't hide the wince. I am a parasite too, Allagan, she said, her voice dropping the corporate facade, exposing the cold, hard reality beneath. I bought your life's work for a fraction of its future value. I paraded you in front of a board of billionaires. If this engine fails, I will liquidate this facility, write off the loss and ruin your professional reputation to protect my firm's stock price. Do not confuse a moment of shared desperation on this floor for loyalty. Allagan stood up. He walked over to the workbench, grabbing a dirty rag to wipe his hands. He didn't look intimidated by her threat. He looked relieved. I don't want your loyalty, Vivian, Allagan said, tossing the rag aside. Loyalty is for dogs. I want your greed. Vivian looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. Hayes's greed is soft, Allagan explained, leaning against the heavy iron chassis of the Mark III. He wants an easy win. He wants a shiny box. But your greed is violent. You're willing to burn your own hands to protect the investment. You don't care that this machine is ugly. You don't care that I smell like a landfill. You only care that the math works. And right now, I need someone ruthless enough to force the rest of the world to swallow the math." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. It wasn't the silence of friends or even allies. It was the friction of two entirely opposite materials being forced together under immense pressure to create an unbreakable alloy. Vivian looked at the grease-stained contract on the table. She picked it up, folding it carefully in half, and then tore it down the middle. She dropped the pieces into a metal waste bin. "The grid test in Nevada is scheduled for next month," Vivian said, her voice returning to its sharp, authoritative hum. She stood up, ignoring the ache in her knees. "We need to scale the core by a factor of 10, which means we need a cooling loop the size of a school bus. The copper piping alone will cost 4 million, Allagan noted, grabbing a clipboard. "I'll wire 5 by noon," Vivian replied, walking toward the exit. She paused at the door, turning back to look at the massive, ugly, brilliant machine and the exhausted mechanic standing next to it. "And Allagan?" He looked up. "When we build the Nevada prototype," Vivian said, a faint, razor-thin smile touching the corners of her mouth, "leave the iron exposed. I want them to see the rust." Allagan didn't smile back, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Vivian pushed the heavy door open and walked out into the sterile corporate hallway, the smell of ozone clinging to her clothes like a permanent warning. They were going to tear down the world's energy grid, and it was going to be an ugly, brutal, incredibly profitable war. In a world obsessed with polished packages and empty promises, the people who actually change the future are usually the ones with grease under their fingernails. Vivian and Allagan didn't build a friendship. They built an empire based on raw, brutal friction. Do you think ruthless greed can actually drive positive innovation, or does it always corrupt the creator? Drop your debate in the comments below. If you want more stories about the cutthroat, messy reality behind closed corporate doors, smash that like button, share this with a fellow hustler, and subscribe for the next pitch. Main characters: Vivian Mercer, Allagan Ford, Gregory Hayes. Money doesn't buy vision. It only buys the box you put it in. Vivian didn't save Allagan because she was a saint. She did it because she couldn't stand watching fools miss the future right in front of them. What would you have done? Would you have laughed at the grease or read the math? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more stories about the messy, cutthroat reality of innovation, hit that like button, share this with a hustler, and subscribe. The next pitch is already waiting.